meeting room in a couple of minutes here. We want to try to stay on time this evening, both for our guest, Sister Christine Schenk, and also we want to start this evening by remembering Congressman John Lewis. I mean, we just a week ago this evening had Robin's wonderful presentation on her documentary, Come Walk in My Shoes. And so, we spent time reflecting on John Lewis's legacy and his life, and little did we know that he would pass away on Friday. It was Friday night, right, that he passed. So we thought that given, really all that he meant to this country, but our proximity and just talking about him, that we would like to start our opening prayer this evening by remembering John Lewis. So Robin Smith and Bill Plant are going to help with this prayer. And they're not masquerading as me, even though my name is on their little window. I just happened to send them my link. So I'm going to share a screen so you can all follow along with our prayer of blessing this evening for the death of a beloved. And it's prayer or blessing by John O'Donoghue, who was an Irish poet. Though we need to weep your loss, you dwell in that safe place in our hearts, where no storm or night or pain can reach you.
Your love was like the dawn brightening over lives, awakening beneath the dark, a further adventure of color.
The sound of your voice found for us a new music that brightened everything.
Whatever you unfolded in your gaze quickened in the joy of its being. You placed smiles like flowers on the altar of the heart. Your mind always sparkled with wonder at things.
Though your days here were brief, your spirit was live, awake, complete.
We look towards each other no longer from the old distance of our names. Now, you dwell inside the rhythm of breath, as close to us as we are to ourselves.
Though we cannot see you with outward eyes, we know our soul's gaze is upon your face, smiling back at us from within everything to which we bring our best refinement.
Let us not look for you only in memory, where we would grow lonely without you. You would want us to find you in presence, beside us when beauty brightens, when kindness glows, and music echoes eternal tones.
When orchids brighten the earth, darkest winter has turned to spring. May this dark grief flower with hope in every heart that loves you.
May you continue to inspire us to enter each day with a generous heart, serve the call of courage and love until we see your beautiful face again in that land where there is no more separation, where all tears will be wiped from our mind, and where we will never lose you again. Thank you, Robin and Bill. I know that John Lewis was a friend, and I'm sure you're grieving his loss, and so many in this country are grieving the loss of this great man. But I think he should be canonized in the Catholic Church for all that he's done, that he did for so many people and for this country. So we'll continue to remember him and grieve his passing. With that, I want to welcome our guest this evening, Sister Christine Schenk. We're welcoming you as a guest, but at the same time, you're a Georgetown alum, so you once trod this neighborhood that so many of us see on a regular basis here. At the same time, Christine is actually a native of Ohio. We were born in the same town of Lima, Ohio, so there you go.
Two country girls made good.
That's right. So a little more about Christine. It was in 2013 that she stepped down from her position as the founding director of FutureChurch, and I put a link to FutureChurch in the chat for you, which was an international coalition of parish-centered Catholics working for full participation of all Catholics in the life of the church. I can remember becoming familiar with FutureChurch when I was living in Toledo, and became part of that organization then. So Christine led the organization from 1990 to 2013. And it really worked to help transform a lot of work in dioceses and parishes across the country, reflecting the values of Vatican II. Sister Chris is a sister of St. Joseph, and she at one time worked as a midwife in Cleveland, Ohio. As I mentioned, she's a graduate of Georgetown University and has 2 master's degrees from Boston College and also an MA in theology from St. Mary's Seminary and Graduate School of Theology in Cleveland. So her recent book, Crispina and Her Sisters, Women and Authority in Early Christianity, as she'll discuss with us tonight, explores the visual imagery that's been found on burial artifacts of prominent early Christian women. It was published in 2017 by Fortress Press. I know you can find it on Amazon if you want to check it out this evening. It's the winner of 2 awards from the Catholic Press Association, first place in history, and 3rd place for first-time author of a book. So before I welcome Christine, I just want to say a word about Q&A tonight. If you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function and put your questions there. I think hopefully as we go along, we'll be able to have some of you unmute and ask your questions. We just have to kind of gauge our time this evening after Christine's presentation. So with that, Chris, and welcome virtually back to Georgetown.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And I really, I cherish my time at Georgetown. It was one of the best things that happened to me in my life. So I am very grateful for everything the university gave me. I also am very grateful to you for having me, and to Blessed Trinity Parish. It's Holy Trinity, right? I think. And your Women Who Stayed series. It's something I wish I could clone and get going in many other parishes around the country and indeed around the world, because as I have discovered in my own adventures, women and many men are very hungry to know what is the history of women in early Christianity. And part of the reason that we're hungry to know that is because women are very rarely mentioned in ancient literary texts. And so I know that you're already somewhat familiar with some biblical women in early Christianity. So as a way of framing my remarks on the visual data, I'm going to just do a brief run through, focusing, I'd say, more on sort of the situating women in the socio-cultural context, and also sort of dealing with what happened, because certainly as both Paul's letters and the Gospels show us, women did serve in co-equal discipleship roles. Certainly with Paul, like with Prisca and Aquila, he tells us all the churches of the Gentiles owe them a are in their debt, and he calls them his co-workers in Christ Jesus. And of course, Junia and Andronicus are apostles, foremost, preeminent among the apostles. And we know from Paul's letter to the Romans that women founded house churches in like Prisca and Aquila. The husband-wife team founded house churches in Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome. And of course, Lydia, and then Phoebe was the prostatis, or the benefactor. She was the diakonos, but also an envoy who probably carried the letter of the Romans to Rome. So we know from those early texts that women were in very prominent positions of leadership, but as I would say the decades and then the centuries wore on, I think the very strong evangelizing efforts of women met with very hard and difficult pushback from the broader Greco-Roman culture. This is all summarized in the first 2 chapters of my book, if you're interested. I would say, beginning with the letter to Timothy, which I'm just going to quote here, says, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing. Now, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness." I always say, does anybody notice the heresy here? The heresy is women are saved through Jesus Christ, just like men, not through childbearing, okay? So Timothy's letter was probably reflective of pushback from prominent Roman thinkers, anti-Christian Roman thinkers like Celsus, who chastised women for going about and evangelizing through the wool dresser's shop and telling people that they didn't have to obey their husbands. Other threads of this actually are found in the Acts of Thecla, who embraced a life of celibacy, the stories tell us, and evangelized throughout Asia Minor. Now that Acts is, it's sort of like, it's probably based on real stories about real women, because it was wildly popular throughout the Roman Empire. So much so it was really part of the canon up until the 4th or 5th century. And so what's underneath all this? Well, what's underneath all this is that women were breaking out of the expected cultural roles for women. Christian women, because of the message of Jesus and because of the preaching of Paul, who had joined them to embrace celibacy. And for women, of course, this was a way out of patriarchal marriage. So it had many good things about it, socioculturally as well as spiritually. And so this was, leading to major pushback. And we see it reflected then in the next 3 centuries when, through the church orders, the apostolic tradition, the Didascalia Apostolorum, the Apostolic Constitution, quoted again and again and again over the next 3 centuries. 1 Timothy, women are to be silent and they are not to teach. Okay, so obviously then, I just want to name 3 differences by 4th century Christianity that was owed to Christian women, 3 differences in the empire. And one is that celibacy was dismantled, mandatory marriage was no longer a pillar of patriarchy. The second one is because of the work of widows, particularly such as Tabitha and Grapte, no longer was it legal to expose Roman children on the hillside. As you remember, the widows took in the orphans, many of them were abandoned children. And the third thing is that, and this is the most important takeaway that also led to all the turmoil about women in leadership, is that Christianity was now the religion of the empire, and it spread through the domestic house churches, such as we've heard about with Prisca and Lydia. It spread through missionary couples like Junia and Andronicus. It spread through business networks, through female patrons like Lydia. and Phoebe and Olympias. So all of this is one of the reasons why on February 14th, 2007, Pope Benedict said, quote, "The history of Christianity would have turned out very differently without the contribution of women." And he went on to say, "The female presence was anything but secondary." And so I always think, well, if it wasn't secondary, what was it? It was either equivalent to males or it was primary. And so the history of women was foundational to the success of early Christianity spreading throughout the Greco-Roman world. And I'm going to try to share my screen now and see how that goes. Does that come over? Can you see it?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so here's the Greco-Roman Empire, and this is where Christianity spread, because as you can see, the empire was all over surrounding the Mediterranean world. It wasn't only in Rome that Roman culture spread, because every major city had taken on Roman customs over a period of 300, 400 years. And these included, you know, things like forums and Colosseums and Basileia, where the judgment seats were. But one of the other things that was very common were Roman funerary customs. So as I said before, it didn't take, given the fact that we know so little about women from the literary sources, the written sources, and what we know is written through the lens of men primarily, it didn't take scholars long to think about and recognize that visual imagery and artifacts could provide information about women in the early church that wasn't available or perhaps sometimes distorted in the written history. And that's what my book is all about. So first I'm going to talk a bit. This is going to be a romp through a lot of data. So please bear with me, but we need to do some foundational ideas about this. And one of them is that according to art historians Steinberg, Janet Huskinson, and others who have studied Roman portrait sarcophagi, which is what you see in front of you, in the Roman mind, the sarcophagus or the burial art constituted monument filled with meaning. It was not just a container for a corpse, but a monument that constructed the identity of the deceased. And it was meant to commemorate the deceased's virtues and values. And so let's just walk through a moment what that might mean. Well, this is what we call a portrait sarcophagi, and you can see, I don't know if you can see my little arrow there, but you can see the portrait of the couple whose tomb this is. And this tomb commemorates the victory of Achilles over Penthesilea, who was the queen of the Amazons, and Achilles was the king, you know, the main warrior. So part of the myth goes that Achilles won and he killed Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, and as she was dying, he fell in love with her, okay? And so here's a close-up. And so for this couple, this tomb represents, in their thinking, sort of the huge, larger than life scope of their love and the undying nature of their love. So you can see how this couple is accessing the myths of their own culture to say something about who they are. So that is a mythological tomb, and it was very popular. Another very popular Roman tomb, and the reason I'm going through this, by the way, is that Christians were Roman. You know, they were Roman citizens. Christianity really didn't spread to any significant degree in Palestine, but it was the Gentile women world through the evangelization of efforts of all of these women and many men, of course. But they were part of their Roman culture, and their Roman culture was a part of them. So when it came to constructing their tomb memorials, they adopted the same sort of ideas and artwork from their surrounding culture. So another important idea in Roman culture as the sarcophagi developed over the years is the idea of the educated or the literary person. And this is another tomb of a husband and wife. And you can see the woman is central. It may well be her tomb. Here's her husband. We don't have any more information but what the portraits are, and that's what these statues are. And one of the big things here, or you can see, are the scrolls. And it was very important for Romans to show themselves as literate. And this was a sign of their status and their importance and the things that they valued. Now, I should say at the beginning, all of these tombs are only the very wealthy could afford these kind of sarcophagi because they're made from marble. Many of them are imported marble. But again, you see the values of what this couple is trying to say, and see the woman herself holding the scroll. And she's a veiled woman, which says in this that she was a pious woman. Here's another wonderful Roman sarcophagus again. This is a muse sarcophagus. The muses were the ones who provided inspiration to Rome. And you can see they have different signs of their masks and different signs of what kind of inspiration they give. You can see the wife is here, the husband is here, he's seated with a scroll, she's shown with a lyre. There are 9 muses. So if you count, and muses are always shown as standing figures. So if you count the number of muses here, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Whoops, there's only 8. Whoops, here's the 9th muse. So this husband is trying to say his wife was his inspiration. So these are just some examples of Roman sarcophagi on which the Christians, and again, these are all 3rd to 5th century. And part of my interest in doing this project had to do with the fact is once we got through the biblical women and a little bit about 1st, 2nd century women, we didn't know what happens with women. So that was why I got fascinated by this topic. So anyway, here is the Roman sarcophagi. Thankfully, a wonderful Danish scholar, Steinberg, completed an extensive study of the Roman tombs, and that in them of 166 non-Christian portrait sarcophagi. And Christian tombs are Roman tombs too, but Burke confined herself only to the non-Christian Roman tombs, which is an estimated 90% of the preserved material. She found portraits roughly equal of solo men and solo women, 186 couples, 80 children unknown. So this was her research that thankfully completed about a year before I started my own project. For her, also, she found that learned women depicted with a scroll, were the most popular representation for non-Christian women. And of the 382 female portrait sarcophagi, 160 show them through a learned female figure. And I guess further, just to reiterate again, representations of learned female figures were found almost as frequently as learned male figures. So you can see there was a lot in elite Roman families, at least in their funerary art, there's a lot of equality expressed in the motifs that are expressed. So now I'm just going to do a few things on catacomb art, and then we'll go into my study of 3rd to 5th century Roman sarcophagi and the motifs. So Christian Roman sarcophagi. This is, again, a catacomb fresco meant to show the virtues and values represented of the deceased. I'm sorry, I did that by mistake. And this is a wealthy woman's tomb. I don't know why we don't want to stay there, but we don't. Veneranda, who she is to be venerated. She's shown in late 4th, early 5th century garb with Petronella Martyr. And who is a 1st century woman, you see this, no veil, toga. And what's significant is that both of these representations show, this is Veneranda's tomb. She wants to show herself as a learned person, And so she's shown with this codex. Petronilla the martyr, though, interestingly enough, is shown, and this is consistent with what we know of women in the 1st and 2nd centuries, is shown with this little thing at the bottom, this little basket with a strap on it to go over your shoulder, and it says scroll bundles. And the early evangelists took scrolls because at that time it was Hebrew and Christian scriptures. We didn't have many of the, maybe some of Paul's letters. We didn't have the codices that we had later of the Christian scriptures. So Veneranda, basically, one interpretation, is modeling her own ministry as a woman of the word. She wants to show herself upon her hero, Petronilla from the 1st century. And there's a lot more about it in the book that we don't have time to today, but I just want to show you how Christians carried through the motifs, number one, and number two, what were signs of authority that were shown, especially by women, but also by men, and having the scriptures is certainly one sign of authority. In this one, we see Paul, just if you think I was wondering, here's Paul with the capsa, the basket at the bottom with the scrolls, and he's holding a scroll. And so just to try to get some idea, here's another catacomb fresco of Trula and Pacce. This is from the catacombs in Naples. The previous one is from the catacombs of Domitilla, Veneranda. In any case, Trula and Pacce is shown with the Gospels, Johannes, Marcus, Matthew, and it was probably Luke here. She's shown in an orange or praying posture, and here's the thing that says Trula and Pacce. So she wanted her tomb art to be shown as a prayerful, praying person, also very literate and possibly preaching about Matthew, Mark, etc. Here's another one from the same catacombs. I love this one. I just got this last year. It's called Trula and Pacce. Again, she's shown with all 4 biblical texts above her head and the Christogram. And what's interesting here is a depiction of Paul. And Paul has always shown the same way in ancient art with sort of this long thin face and pointy beard, but he's in an acclaiming posture toward this. And on the other side, which has been lost to history, is Peter also in the same posture. Hang on to that thought. We'll see it more in the catacombs. So here is Crispina, who I named my book after, because she's one of the few sarcophagus woman who is named. There very rarely do you have names attached to her, but this is definitely a portrait tomb. You can see from her face, and she's cradling a codex, which has, guess what, the Christogram, the PX right there with her name. And there's all these why you know it's a female figure and male figure that I won't go into, but are detailed in excruciating detail in my book. Anyway, I love the way she's cradling the scripture. And then to her, we only have to us to the right side of her tomb. The left one has been lost, but here are 2 unnamed figures. Notice this one's holding a scroll. Here's Jesus proclaiming and with the multiplication of the loaves. This is the arrest of Peter, and Peter striking the rock in his cell and baptizing his jailer on the far right. Now those last 2 vignettes are not scriptural, but they come from the Acts of Peter, which is an apocryphal extra-canonical work. But you know, this is Rome, they love Peter. And so Peter shows up these 2 stories in pretty much all of them. Okay, so here's another, again, Crispina is showing herself with these biblical stories, with the multiplication of the loaves and the sufferings of Peter and the baptism. Okay, so here's another biblical women's tomb. It's a portrait tomb. She's shown veiled. And in this place, though, she's got her hands in this gesture, as a preaching or a speaking gesture, and she's holding down here a book or a codex, okay? So again, this is a prominent Christian woman. This one we have no name, but here are the biblical stories that were important to her. And again, she's portraying herself in a certain way, she or her family, to construct the idea of what was her identity and what were her virtues and what did she value. And you can see what she valued here are preaching or teaching about the biblical stories. This is Jesus right here, holding a scroll and with his hands over this face, the man born blind. Here's Jesus again with the multiplication of the loaves. To the right of that is Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. On this side, this is probably not Jesus, but Ezekiel raising the dry bones. And the early Christians didn't have a category or the early Romans didn't have a category for miracle. So what they had was magic. So you often show these prominent spiritual figures with this wand. So that was Ezekiel raising the dry bones. Once again, Peter being arrested by the two jailers. Again, notice he's holding a scroll because the Christians very much, excuse me, wanted to show their heroes as prominent, important people of status. I'm sorry. And of course, last again, here's Peter striking water from a rock. Here's yet another one. This woman doesn't have her hand in a speaking gesture, but her mouth is open and she's holding a scroll. And in her tomb, we see the nativity, the baptism of Isaac, and the raising of Jairus' daughter. And on this side, we don't know exactly what this one is. It could be Peter's betrayal, partly because of the iconography with the head, but this is definitely Jesus being arrested and going before Caiaphas, and you can't see it too well, but Caiaphas has a little yarmulke on his head. Again, in the Roman, many scholars didn't think that Christians had embedded figures in their story, but this is the raising of Jairus' daughter. This is undoubtedly the woman whose mother, and this is probably her child. And the reason we know that, her dead daughter, is because this is not a bed, this is a sarcophagus. And it has these little lion feet that you can tell, and she's wrapped in a shroud. And of course, this is Jesus doing the miracle with the wand and Jairus. And the woman obviously is a very strong picture. So just to give you some idea of how much the early 3rd to 5th century Christians appropriated the customs of their own culture and the beliefs of their own religion to say who they were and what was important to them. And that's one aspect. We'll get into another aspect in a moment. This is a married couple, and almost always in married couple depictions, both in Roman and Christian art, only the male carries the scroll. But again, this is a wealthy couple. You can tell because she's got jewelry. This is their whole tomb. We won't go through all the stories, but again, this is a wealthy Christian couple that are displaying their beliefs in Jesus through texts and in God through texts from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. So now we're going to get into sort of the nitty-gritties of my own study of 2,119 images. And it's a long story, but I'll tell you the story in a minute, but I analyzed 2,119 images in all the published plates of Christian tombs from the 3rd to the 5th century. And out of these, the total artifacts that I recorded in a database was just 762, because so many of the plates were of fragments that you couldn't tell really what it was, or it was vegetal images. And out of those, I identified 558 as definitely Christian. And I was very strict on how I said what was Christian and what wasn't. And I did that because only on the basis of biblical figures. And then out of that, 312 actually had portrait figures of the deceased. And the reason you had to be so careful of that, because then you knew that somebody had a real say in what images appeared on the sarcophagi, okay? Now this was the big aha, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened moment in the study. And out of 312 portraits on 247 sarcophagi, some had 2 portraits, the number of solo female portraits outnumbered the solo male portraits by 3 to 1. There were 156 solo female compared to 47 solo male. Remember, in the non-Christian Roman sarcophagi, the portraits were equal. So this already says something in the material plane that had long been suspected by literary scholars, and that female Christians were far more influential in the early church than commonly recognized. And as this shows, they were also tended to be of higher status and wealth, okay? So this was a really big deal because I ran statistics on all of this, and the likelihood that the difference was due to chance is just 1 in 1,000. Here are some of the portrayals, and unlike the non-Christian tombs, the male is never shown, the woman is never shown with a scroll, Steinberg and others. In Christian tombs, I found at least 6 where the woman is shown with the scroll and the male is not. And this is just one of them. And again, this is another indication of Christian women being very influential and prominent. So let's go now to portrait figures that are shown with motifs of scrolls, codices, scroll bundles, or capses, and again, testifying to the status of the deceased. And I did all statistics. I'm going to rush through these pretty fast. There were no statistical differences between the male and female portrait tombs. Likewise, with speech gestures, there were no statistical difference. Now, the reason this is important is, remember, we've got 1 Timothy being quoted again and again and again all through the church orders. I don't permit a woman to teach or preach. And yet you've got evidence from their tombs that women were doing that very thing anyway. Again, Christian portraits with scroll capsa, and at least at the same incidence as the male portraits. No statistically significant difference there. So unless you think this little speech gesture wasn't important, this is from a stained glass window from a parish in Cleveland. I think of it's Pius IX with his hand in the preaching gesture and holding a scroll of the book of the Gospels here. So it came down through history as a sign of authority. So this is what the point of all these studies are. I hope they're not too esoteric. Okay, I think we're still doing okay. Got a couple minutes left. The other big thing is the orans or prayer figure. In this case, this woman is shown with actually it's a scrinium, but it's a thing for scrolls. And again, we have in-facing apostle figures on either side of her. Here's another Marcia Celsia at the museum at Arles. And again, it's the orans, the prayer figure, which is also a learned figure that derives from the muse. And here's Marcia's whole tomb. I'm sorry, we have to go through these. This became so popular that some of the men adapted it. This is a male over a female body. And so we found that every once in a while. So again, female orans did outnumber the male orans by a lot, but that's because it derived from the muse, which was always female. So because the orans was also a learned figure, I included statistics about that. And again, no statistically significant difference between men and women. Now, this is the image that caught my eye when I first visited the Vatican, the museums at the Pio Cristiano Museum, because I thought, oh, that's interesting. This woman is holding a scroll and she's got these 2 in-facing apostolic looking figures. And wouldn't you know, right down the hall, here's Jesus holding a codex, hands in a teaching position with 2 in-facing apostle figures. And here's another one of Jesus. Again, you can't see the scroll, but on 2 in-facing and seated. On further exploration in my study, we found this 3rd century Roman tomb that of a magistrate that art historians say became iconic for how Christians represented authority on their tombs. And you can see these two in-facing figures that are actually the wife and daughter, but he's also seated as a magistrate. And so you can see the later art, Jesus again seated, legs akimbo there, in-facing figures. She's not seated, but she's got the in-facing apostle figures. So that led to a very extensive and exhaustive study of in-facing apostle figure authority depictions. And sure enough, we have way more female portraits shown in that posture than men. It's such a statistically significant difference that the chances of it being due to chance is 2 in 1,000. So why would that be? Well, some people said it's because it's their figures accompanying the woman into paradise, or that they're filler figures. The trouble with those interpretations is that Christ was shown in this in-facing apostle figure more often than either men or women, and it's 166 times. And Christ obviously doesn't need accompanying into paradise. So my hypothesis in the original research that I did is that this is a time when women were being told they could not preach and teach. They could no longer lead house churches because worship was moving into the public space out of house churches. They were even being told they could not come to Sunday services if they were menstruating. So to have a woman's authority to preach and to teach and have leadership authority within the community was under attack. And in my mind, these women, deceased women, were trying to show that their ministry was validated by none other than Peter and Paul, because the iconography on many of them show that. Okay, I'm just going to do one last thing because can you hang in with me? Should I stop, or can we do one last quick thing?
I think we can do one last thing, Chris, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay,
because I don't want to lose the point of the whole thing. So, and that is, how did these Christians view what was going to happen with their tomb art? Because obviously it was very important. So let's just walk through a woman. We'll call this woman that you see on the screen, we'll call her Junia. And it's a name I made up. We don't know what her name is. But so this is what would have happened. Several years before Junia died, she or her family would have commissioned a uniquely sculpted sarcophagus to memorialize her and all of the values that shaped her identity. When she died, her sarcophagus would be delivered to her home, where she would lie in state for up to 7 days, so family members, clients, and friends could pay their respects and gaze upon her carefully carved memorial. They entered into a liminal space, sort of a space, the thin places, or what our Irish people would say, to reflect upon Junia's life, her values, her beliefs, and inevitably the meaning of their own life and death. Janet Tulloch, a specialist in early Christian images, has observed that ancient art was viewed as social discourse meant to draw the viewer in as a participant, and that art was understood to perform meaning, not simply embed them. So, using Tulloch's criteria, it's possible and plausible, then probable, that Junia wished her loved ones to enter into this liminal space and experience Christ's power as seen on her tomb. And this is Adam and Eve. This is Cain, and I'm describing the tomb now. This is Cain and Abel bringing the first fruits to God the Father. This is Jesus healing the paralytic, Jesus healing the one born blind, the wedding feast at Cana with all the little jars, and the raising of Lazarus. So this is what Junia chose to have on her tomb, including her holding a codex with her hands in a preaching or teaching gesture. So she wanted those who came to pay their respects and to experience Christ's power to reverse the effects of the fall from paradise. And namely, this would mean healing the blind and the lame, providing an abundance of wine in the new reign of God, and raising Lazarus and Junia from the dead. So where did Junia find her authority to witness and teach about Christ? A hint is found in the close-up of her face, which has been carefully sculpted close to the face of Christ, who leans in almost as if to whisper in her ear. Junia and her family wished her to be remembered as someone who taught with the authority of Christ. Her mourners commune not only with the departed Junia, but also with the Christ, who heals and raises up through the meaning evoked and performed by the art on her sarcophagus. Junia exhorts the living to embrace the Christ who authorized her ministry and to whom she witnesses from beyond the grave. She joins a sisterhood of Christian women, past and present, who obey an authority that supersedes any who would silence them. Junia is one of countless women who witness that they are made in God's image and called to serve in persona Christi. Amen. So I know it went a bit long, but thank you for listening. Yeah.
How long did it take you to do all of this research and looking at these?
Altogether, it was about 4 years.
Okay.
And it wasn't helped by the fact that the plates, I had great support from Dr. Carolyn Osiek, I have to say, who I never would have done it if she hadn't agreed to read my chapters. She's just a scholar. And Dr. Umberto Utro, who's the curator of the Pio Cristiano Museum in Rome, pointed me to 3 volumes of plates that were done mostly by German scholars. And that's where I got all the stuff and entered into a database. And of course, it was a challenge because all the descriptors were in German. And I had 1 year of high school German, but thankfully it wasn't hard because there's only much vocabulary you're going to use to describe a 3rd to 5th century sarcophagus, and most of it has biblical figures. Anyway, shouldn't get me going. I want to shut up now and make room for other questions. Thank you.
So Jama Halter, you had a question. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask?
Yes.
Hey, James.
Hi, nice to see you. I'm just wondering what the Jesuits make of this research. They're known for their careful scholarship. I don't know if they've written about it in the past, but as a Jesuit parish, that's important to us to kind of think about, and especially the top Jesuit, the Pope. I'm just wondering if he's weighed in, or if any feedback from the Vatican about this.
No, well, only insofar as when we went to we do a pilgrimage every 2 years to Rome, alternating with Greece. And the last time I sent copies of the books to everyone who helped me, which were so many people, especially Dr. Utro, and we took our folks to the Pio Cristiano Museum, and when he found out we were coming, he wanted to meet with us. And so when we went, he and Dr. Rosanna De Pinto, who helped me so much getting the images, because the Vatican was very helpful, because those images, they normally charge some astronomical price, like 250 euros per image, and I needed like 40 of them. And they gave me a very good deal, shall we say. And so Dr. Rosanna De Pinto was wonderful with that. But Dr. Utro, when he came out to greet us, it made me cry. It's probably gonna make me cry now. He told me I had made a real contribution to the scholarship. And so that meant more to me than what the Pope thought. But I haven't sent the Pope my book. As far as the Jesuits go, Father Brian McDermott, who many of you may know at Georgetown, was also fascinated by the project. I knew him through my friend Joe Newth, who runs the Ignatian Spirituality Institute here in Cleveland, and had supper with him a couple times. And he was really interested in the project. So I gave him a copy of the book, and he read it and he loved it. And so they did a review in America, and he did a very nice job reviewing it. So I was, and it's gotten very good attention from the scholarly community too. which you hope for, but you know, I did, frankly, I didn't feel like I was qualified to write this book. I mean, I do have a background in clinical research as a nurse midwife, and a background in theology, but I kept trying to get Carolyn Osick or Janet Tulloch, because I just felt these tombs, nobody knows about them. Nobody's ever seen them. And we have to get this out there, and we need to write a book about it. Won't we write a book? None of them would write a book about it. So I thought, well, damn, then I'm going to write the book about it. And I'm so glad I did. And so, but as I said, I probably would not have trusted I didn't feel like I had this. I now know why nobody did this before as a doctoral dissertation. I kept thinking somebody would have done this. And but it's so wide ranging. You had to know all the biblical stuff, the church history stuff, the art historian stuff. So I got it. So anyway, I'm sorry I'm babbling.
No, that's fine.
It was quite a trip, but I did love it.
So we have a question from Rosemary Lyon, who is asking, first of all, she mentions that her father was born in Lima, Ohio, just like you. There you go. Tonight for everybody born in Lima. But she asked, could you remind us of the date of the Julia sarcophagus? Is it later than the other ones you had shown earlier? And she said that
no, it's 4th century. The thing about it is that usually what they do is they give a range. So it's 4th century. I can't tell you whether, I'd have to look up whether it's the first, just a minute. Let me see if I can do this on my, see, I don't think I can do it while I'm on with you. Let's see. Oh, I don't have the date, but I don't know whether it's the first part of the 4th century or the last part, but are we still there?
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
But it is 4th century. They're all 4th century.
okay.
Someone heard, it's in the book, but I think I want to say it's like 425, between 425 and, I mean 325 and 350.
All right. And Marcia has a question about Junia. Marcia, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
So my father was also born in Lima. So I don't know what it is about Lima, Ohio. It's a teeny town to have so many of us.
And we're
So my
all
question,
in the church here.
my question about Junia is, in her sarcophagus, she did have the Christ figure giving her inspiration. Do you think she was what we would call a nun? Do you think she was celibate and had dedicated her life to Christ?
It could be, but there's nothing in her sarcophagus to say that. And there are many, many, many prominent married women who were equally active. I didn't have time to go through all of the literary parallels with the tomb people, but like one of them was Proba, who was a very prominent married woman who wrote a cento, which is based on Virgil, but actually it was a sort of a literary genre that was very popular at the time among the elite. And she did a cento about the life of Jesus that became a prominent evangelizing tool for like over 2 centuries. So I don't know, many of the tombs are, even though they're solo male or solo female portraits, usually there's just one person buried. Sometimes they'll find a child buried in the same tomb. So this could have been, quote unquote, Junia's tomb, and her husband could have had a tomb down the road. So I wouldn't want to say there was a movement toward urban monasticism at the time, but none of they were very ascetic women, and they never would have had an expensive tomb like this because it would have gone against everything they valued about living a simple life. So if I had to guess, I'd say it's more likely that she was married and in a family of considerable means. But we have no way of knowing.
Right. Other questions? Again, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. So Chris, I think one question is how can we sort of make sort of use of this book in our parishes? How can preachers best use it? How can we, I guess, incorporate it into church life to create awareness of the significance of these women?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking. I did write a sort of a succinct article for Celebration, which is a publication of National Catholic Reporter. I'll be happy to send you the PDF. And if you want to share that around with folks, it's just sort of another way of getting inside what the culture was in the 3rd to 5th century and what women were experiencing. And for me, the inspiring part is even though we've got 3 centuries of church orders telling them to be silent and not teach, but they kept right on doing it, you know, and that's sort of the untold story, I think, really of women, because no one can take that from you, that need to tell people about your faith and about Christ, you know. And so to me, it was very wonderful to see the historical data about it for sure. But I'd be happy to send you the PDF, the PDF of that article. And, you know, one of the things that, I don't know if Georgetown would ever do it, but Xavier in Cincinnati did this really terrific sort of exhibit of what the early Christian art in relationship to women, because it is a lot more about the women in many ways than you see. And all those are Ron's figures. The early archaeologists, Christian archaeologists, said they were all female, and invariably they said that it meant that they were souls. They disembodied them from real women because I think it couldn't register that there would be proportionally so many more that were women. And so for me, the message here is women were very prominent in evangelization in early Christianity. And that's the thing most of us don't know about. I mean, I grew up thinking it was Jesus and 12 men and all those men who did this all through history, you know, until maybe we got to, I don't know, Claire of Assisi or somebody. And so, and part of this, why I did this is because I was so passionate to find out where the women were and what they were doing. And so frankly, what you're doing is phenomenal because it is helping all of us appropriate as part of our lost history.
Thank you. So Peggy, Cordy, you have a question.
I want to thank you. I'm so thrilled to hear your talk. A number of years ago, I went with a Jesuit and a group of people from this area, from the Holy Trinity, on an ancient Christian art and archaeology tour. Ooh. And it was mostly 3rd to the 8th century, but we went earlier. And we schlepped through, we saw these portrait sarcophagi, many of them. Mm-hmm. And the Jesuit who taught us talked quite a bit about the particular figures and the parables and the stories that from the Bible, and said, oh, that's Jesus doing this and Jesus doing that, and Paul and Peter. But obviously, because he didn't have your book, we didn't know all of the significance of the individualization of the figures, particularly the women in the middle. And so what a gift, to learn so much so well. So I want to thank you for your scholarship. It really adds another layer of meaning to the whole thing.
I'm glad. I love getting inside. Why would they do this? You know?
Yeah.
So that was, and you know, these really did not become on public display until 2005. It was Pope Benedict. So I think that was just serendipitous, you know, really.
Right, and this particular scholar had a lot of connections in Rome and was able to reserve tours for this small group.
Oh, that's awesome.
Arranged to take us through. So anyway, I just can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. It's music.
I can't wait to order your book for some of our fellow travelers, myself, to read it.
Chris, I have a question. Can I come to Rome with you next time you go?
Oh, love it. Whatever that is.
That would be great. I want to thank you too for coming and spending this time with us. We are so honored to have you here, scholar and founder of FutureChurch and woman of faith. And thank you to Anne and Ashley, as always. And thank you, Bill and Robin, for that lovely tribute to John Lewis, who would say, you got to get into some good trouble, necessary trouble. And he kept the faith. He never gave up. He never gave in. What an inspiration for all of us. And so in that spirit, this week of the Feast of Mary Magdalene, it's so perfect that you have her image right behind you, Christine. But I wanted to just make a few announcements about this week as we celebrate the great apostle to the apostles. I heard a sermon today that talked about the apostolic succession from Mary Magdalene on Catholic Women Preach. Please listen to it. It's so rousing and stirring, but we stand in that apostolic succession. Tomorrow night, we're all invited to Xavier in New York City, who has a group kind of like ours called the Women Who Stayed. And they're having a prayer service. And Rita Houlihan, who I'm pretty sure runs the Catholic Women Speak group, in any event, she'll be speaking. So if you're interested, I can send that out, or we can send it out in a follow-up. Wednesday night, our very own Parish Holy Trinity is having our regular evening prayer. But as David says, it's going to be a little beefed up for the Feast of Mary Magdalene, which is actually on Wednesday. And if you haven't gotten enough by then, stay on your computer and go to FutureChurch's Mary Magdalene service, which will be 7 p.m. And Robin, of special note, because we spoke about the women of the civil rights movement and the music of the civil rights movement, a woman named Kim Harris, who's kind of like the next generation of freedom singers, is going to be preaching and I think singing. So it all ties together. And then, don't forget, our last night of this series will be a week from tonight, and Sean Copeland will come. She's a revered scholar and woman of faith, of the Catholic faith. She teaches at Boston College, or I guess she's emeritus now. She's going to speak about a book she wrote on Henrietta Delisle, who was a woman who founded an African-American order in the 1840s, pre-Civil War in New Orleans. And she was a woman of great courage and took some risks because she did something that was illegal, which was educate children who were enslaved. So she's a precursor to the kind of courage that we saw in John Lewis's life, and that hopefully we can emulate as well. So please come a week from now and hear Sean speak about this woman who is a candidate for sainthood now. We'll have some discussion about that. And I think—
Can I give one more plug for people who are interested? The FutureChurch does have a Women Erased series. They've recorded all of them. So you can just go to the website, and Michael Papard and Carol Dempsey and my own mentor, Carolyn Osiek, did some wonderful, maybe you've already plugged it, but I'll plug it again.
No, plug it. And actually, Christine, did they record your conversations with Teresa Kane?
Yes, they did. Those are also available from the website too.
It's a great resource.
So FutureChurch website to
Yeah, it was my second book. It's called To Speak the Truth in Love. It was a biography of Teresa Kane, and it just won 2 awards from the Catholic Press Association. So I'm feeling like, oh yeah, I guess I really can do this writing thing.
You can. Well, now Jane just wrote in our chat box that you were instrumental in getting Mary Magdalene for Feast Day, and that would be a story for another day that I'd love to hear how you did that. But
yeah, and it's because of people like you. That's how.
Yeah.
Yes, this is Holy Trinity's 3rd annual prayer service to honor the feast of Mary Magdalene. And if you go look at the Vatican announcement for the feast, it says she needed a feast day just like the other apostles.
Yeah.
So she was an apostle as well. But thank you for that work and all your work. And thanks
Yeah.
for
Oh, thank you. We're all in this together, you know.
All right. Thank you so
That's
much.
right. Could I make a comment, please? I thought the series was wonderful, and the series was very, very interesting.
Thank
And
you.
I really enjoyed the series. Thank you, Christine.
Well, there's one more. It's not over. We have one more Monday. So come. We'll
Okay, good. I'll look forward to it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
All right,
you.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Christine.